The global elites and the World Economic Forum's plan to take your property. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over their vision for what the world will look like in 2030. We've all seen the video, and for the sake of those who might have been living under a rock for the past year, editor, cut to the clip. And let's not forget about their blog post titled, "Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better." So what is their dystopian vision for the future? How does it work? And how exactly are they going to take your property? When I've done videos on the World Economic Forum and their Great Reset agenda, or their vision for 2030 in the past, the majority of the comments are questions that, George, how are they going to take my house? As an example. That's what everyone's concerned with, and that's what everyone is trying to figure out. So in this video right now, we're going to address that. Let's dive right in. First and foremost, how do they see this all playing out? Well, it starts with everyone's favorite, Moody the Millennial. That is right. And they are on their bicycle. And you'll notice they're not driving on the street. No, no, no. Because in the future, we don't want concrete, or we won't have any concrete. They'll just be riding along just peacefully on the grass, enjoying the trees and the birds flying and maybe cruising by this little pond. But all of their thoughts and dreams will be going right into the cloud that is controlled by the central planners. In this case, let's assume the government. And who is controlling the government? Well, that would be the global elites and the World Economic Forum. And if this seems like a stretch, if you haven't watched any of my videos on this topic, just sit tight for a moment, because we're going to be going into their blog post where they outline exactly what I'm saying. I'm not making this up. Stay tuned. So then what would happen is the artificial intelligence that was crunching the data and taking the thoughts from Moody the Millennial would go ahead and send Moody the food that they wanted, including everything they need for their next art project. And again, this is from the blog post. I'm not making this up. A drone would deliver that to Moody's house. Well, it's not really Moody's because they don't really own it, but we'll get into that in just a moment. And it would be waiting for Moody when they get back to, we'll call it the house, the communal house. So how does the living situation work? Well, in this dystopian vision for 2030 that the global elites have outlined with the World Economic Forum, you don't pay rent, but everyone shares the same housing stock, and they use it for multiple purposes. One room might be used for sleeping or entertainment. The other room downstairs might be used as an office, depending on who in the community, or in this case, the smart city, wants to use or needs to use the actual space. So you should be scratching your head right now and saying, okay, George, well, this seems extreme, and I don't blame you for thinking that, but who would actually own the house and who would determine who uses the space? Well, that would be the government, and that would be artificial intelligence through crunching the data that's coming from all the individuals in the economy and in society, along with the data they're getting from a central bank digital currency. And you guys have seen my videos on the central bank digital currencies. If you haven't, put a link in the description below. That's a topic for a separate video. But I believe this is how they would allocate the scarce resources that we have as a society and in the economy. So the bottom line is you will own nothing and they will own everything. But to get into the details of their vision, and just so you guys know that I'm not on drugs, Let's go right to the internet and the blog post. So here we go. And in case you are wondering, it is definitely time to sit down and pour yourself that stiff drink. You're going to need it while we go through this insane blog post from an individual at the World Economic Forum. Here we go. Welcome to the year 2030. Welcome to my city, or should I say our city. I don't own anything. I don't own a car. I don't own a house. I don't own any appliances or any clothes. It might seem odd to you, but it makes perfect sense for us in this city. Everything you consider a product has now become a service. We have access to transportation, accommodation, food, all the things we need in our daily lives. One by one, all these things became free. So it ended up not making sense for us to own much. And hopefully, right about now, all of you are saying to yourself, sounds a lot like communism. I think you may be on to something there. Let's move on. Transportation dropped dramatically in price. It made no sense for us to own cars because we could just call driverless vehicles or flying cars for longer journeys within minutes. And just in case you guys missed that, flying cars by 2030. This is their vision. I got to give them credit. They have a very ambitious vision. That is for sure. I guess, that's why we won't need any concrete. Now I can hardly believe we accepted congestion and traffic jams, not to mention the air pollution from combustion engines. What were we thinking? And before I move on, I'd like to remind you that the person who wrote this is not a 7-year-old. It's a grown adult that's part of the World Economic Forum. So, that being said, listen to this. Sometimes I use my bike when I go see some of my friends. I enjoy the exercise and the ride. It kind of gets the soul to come along for the journey. Funny how some things never seem to lose their excitement, like walking, biking, cooking, drawing, or even growing plants. Again, folks, this is a grown adult, not a third grader. In our city, we don't pay any rent because someone else is using our free space whenever we don't need it. My living room is used for business meetings when I'm not there. So this gets to the crux of what we're trying to think through in this video. Who owns your house and how is the space allocated? And again, it would be the government would own your house and the artificial intelligence or the cloud would instruct the individuals where they needed to live, where they needed to work, where they needed to spend time. Again, very similar to the way communist Russia was set up. But as she points out, it's all free, so life has never been better. Just like life in communist Russia was absolutely amazing. This also made the breakthrough of the circular economy much easier. When products are turned into services, no one has an interest in things with a short lifespan. Everything is designed for durability, repairability, and recyclability. Now, I could have just skipped over that part because it doesn't really pertain to what we're saying. But at the end, I want to read to you the author's response to all the criticism they got. And I want to debunk and basically smash the response from the mainstream media who says that anyone that believes this is actually their vision is spreading fake news. We're going to address that as soon as we get done reading the rest of this blog post. So she goes on to write, in the cities, we have plenty of green space and plants and trees all over. I still don't understand why in the past we filled all the free spots in the city with concrete. And here's where it gets even more bizarre than the flying cars, believe it or not. Shopping, I can't really remember what that is. For most of us, it has been turned into choosing things to use. Sometimes I find this fun, and sometimes I just want the algorithm to do it for me. It knows my tastes better than I do by now. So think that through. Again, the thoughts and the dreams are going into the cloud. Artificial intelligence is crunching the real time data and creating a profile for you to the point where the artificial intelligence knows you better than you know yourself. And here's where it goes from being bizarre to flat out creepy. My biggest concern is all the people who do not live in our city, those we lost along the way, those who decided it became too much, all this technology or lack of freedom, those who got upset with the political system and turned against it. In other words, those people who value their own freedom. They live different kind of lives outside the city. Some have formed little self-supplying communities. So again, all those people that are in favor of self-sustainability. This is where the global elite are kind of looking down upon you like you're some sort of Neanderthal living in the Stone Ages. And why on earth wouldn't you want to be a part of this smart city that they controlled? Once in a while, I get annoyed about the fact that I have no real privacy. Nowhere I can go and not be registered. I know that somewhere everything I do, think, and dream of is recorded. Let me say that one more time, just in case you didn't get it. I know that somewhere everything I do, think, and dream is recorded. So remember back on the whiteboard video when most of you were probably thinking that I was completely insane in making things up when I said they see a world that all of us would have some sort of computer chip either under our skin or that we'd have to wear, something like that, that would transmit all of our thoughts and vital signs directly into the cloud in control of the central planners. But here they're coming right out and saying that this is their vision. This is how they see the world operating in 8 or 9 years from today. All in all, it's a good life, much better than the path we were on, where it became so clear that we could not continue with the same model of growth. And here you have to read between the lines, because I have read so many posts from the World Economic Forum and from Klaus Schwab. I know exactly what they're saying. Whenever they use the word model of growth, what they're talking about is free market capitalism. So let me go ahead and reread this in a way that's far easier to understand their message. All in all, it's a good life, much better than the path we were on before, where it came so clear that we could not continue with free market capitalism. And now what they do is they attribute all of the problems that they believe we have onto free market capitalism, private property rights, freedom, and your privacy. We had all these terrible things happening: lifestyle disease, climate change, the refugee crisis, environmental degradation, completely congested cities, water pollution, air pollution, social unrest, and unemployment. We lost too many people before we realized that we could do things differently. So here we've got a fact check from the mainstream media that, of course, is saying that the World Economic Forum is pure as the driven snow, and anything that you read to the contrary is just simply fake news. They say the World Economic Forum does not have a stated goal to remove everyone's private property by 2030. So this is the fact check where they say this is completely false. Notice they use the phrase stated goal. Well, does it really matter whether the goal is stated or whether it is implied? Regardless of whether or not it is their stated goal, it obviously is their vision. And by the way, this is why no one trusts the quote unquote fact checkers,
Because whenever you do this, you realize that they really haven't checked the facts at all. All they're doing is trying to squash views that don't fit their narrative. But let's go to what the author, Ida, said about this shocking blog post. And when I mean shocking, I mean what's most shocking to me is that it was written by a grown adult, like I said earlier, not some 4-year-old with a coloring book. But Ida says that this was not a utopia or dream of the future, but a scenario showing where we could be headed for better or worse. In a written update, she clarified that the piece aimed to start a discussion about the pros and cons of the current technological development when we are dealing with the future. It's not enough to work with reports. We should start discussing in many new ways. This is the intention with the piece. So I want to ask you, if you are trying to start a discussion on the pros and cons of us going into some sort of bizarre dystopian future, would you do that by setting it up as a blog post that has no editorial comments, no dialogue whatsoever? Would you set it up as though it's your specific vision for where we are headed in the future? And by the way, I'd also like to add that each one of the bullet points that she was discussing in the blog post, as far as everything being delivered by drones, no concrete, no more air pollution, the effects of climate change, and of course, you not owning anything and renting everything, those are all talking points and stated objectives of the World Economic Forum in their Great Reset agenda and Fourth Industrial Revolution. So, regardless of whether Ida or the fact checkers on social media or the mainstream media will admit that these are the World Economic Forum's stated goal, if you simply scratch beneath the surface and connect some dots, you'll see that every single talking point that Ida outlines in this post is an explicit objective of the World Economic Forum that they outline in other posts. So by claiming these are not stated goals, at the very best, you're being inconsistent. And at worst, you're just flat out lying.
So taking it back to something everyone can relate to, your house, your property. The way it's set up right now, of course, is you either take the cash, buy the house, and you own the house. In this example, we're using the average Joe. Or you go to the bank, you get a loan, they give you the cash, therefore that loan would be on the balance sheet of the bank. You would have the cash, you'd give it to the seller, so those dollars would still be a liability of the commercial banking system. But the reason I'm going over this is because I want to point out that the loan, if Joe defaults, is on the balance sheet of the bank. Therefore, they are the lien holder. So if Joe doesn't make his house payments, the house goes back to the bank and then they sell it into the market. The entire process only involves entities and individuals in the private sector and in the real economy. But their vision is for us to transition from this world into their utopian vision of the future. So the question is, how? How will we get there? How will they own everything? In other words, how will you lose everything? These are the questions we're going to try to answer in the rest of this video. Step number 2, the psychological manipulation technique called the foot in the door. So after step 1, I'm sure a lot of you are saying to yourself, okay, George, I get it, but there's no way the government is ever going to take my house. I won't let it happen. But I think that if the global elite, World Economic Forum, the politicians, the central planners, if they try to execute this game plan, they're not going to come in and forcibly take your property. I think they're going to set it up in a way that you actually give it to them or you sell it to them. And what I've been seeing in 2020 and 2021 leads me to believe that the first step in achieving this objective would be to set you up to where you're psychologically receptive to whatever they are trying to push. Let me explain. There was a study done many years ago. We're going to go to that study in just a moment. But what it did is it used individuals, I believe 70 people. The way they set this up is with part of the group, they asked them to do something small first, such as put a small sign in your front yard. And then for another portion of the group, they didn't ask them to put up a small sign, but they asked them to sign a petition. And then for the rest of the group, they didn't ask them to do anything. Then after this was done, they went back to the entire group and asked them to put a large sign in their front yard, and then kept track of the percentage of people within each group that said yes. Here's how it played out. The individuals that didn't get a small request at the beginning, when they were asked to put a large sign in their front yard, less than 20% said yes. So what that means is 80% said, hell no, I am not putting a ginormous sign in my front yard. And that would be represented by this individual right here. We'll call him Angry Alan. And before I forget, this is Gullible Gary. And right in the middle, we have Persuadable Pete. So moving on to Pete, this individual represents the group in the study that wasn't given a small sign that was almost identical to asking for a large sign, but they had them sign a petition. So something a little bit different. 55% of those individuals agreed to putting a large sign in their front yard. But with the group of individuals who were asked and actually did put the small sign in their front yard, 76 of the Gullible Garys said, sure, no problem. We'll go ahead and put that sign in our front yard. So the conclusion of this study is that if someone accepts a small request at the beginning, especially if the request pertains to the big request at the end, they're far more likely to say yes at the end than they would if you just asked them the big request up front. And you can see this playing out all the time with digital marketers. They always ask you to do something small first, whether it's to get a free book where you have to just pay for shipping. That's one that I see all the time. All they're doing is trying to get you to buy a $5,000 product, a $10,000 product, a $20,000 product. But if they asked you to buy the $20,000 product without buying a dollar product first, without paying for shipping, without doing something small, the probability of you buying that $20,000 product goes down to almost zero. But if they get you to do one thing, two things, three smaller things that gradually build, then the probability of you buying that $20,000 product is dramatically increased. And like I said earlier, I think we're seeing this play out with the central planners in 2020 and 2021. So let's just think this through. In 2019, if I would have said to you, hey, I think the politicians are going to ask all of Americans to go ahead and wear a mask whenever they go outdoors, what would you have told me? You would have said, I am crazy. There is no way that any American will agree to do that. Well, we got the masks first, but then what did we get? Then we had the central planners tell us we needed to close our business or put a small sign in our front yard. Then they said you need to social distance. And on top of that, you need to lock yourself in your own home to save lives. So maybe this whole process was just setting you up so in the future, they can come back to you and say, listen, we had you lock yourself in your own house to save lives, But now we need you to sell your house in order to save humanity. And I know I might have jumped ahead, and all of you might not be following exactly what I'm saying, but don't worry about it. We're going to address that in detail in step number 3. Whoa, time out. I know right about now your friend and family member Fred is saying, George, you tinfoil hatter, I don't know where you come up with all these ridiculous conspiracy theories. This is complete crazy talk. The government, the politicians, the central planners, they're not using some psychological technique to get society to actually play their game. Well, that may be true. I'm not saying that this is a certainty. I'm saying that this is merely a possibility. But even if this isn't their intention, the net result is still the same. And that is the majority of Americans are far more susceptible today to saying yes to a government request than they were back in 2019. Step number 3, why you will sell your house to them. And by them, I'm referring to the government, who, in my opinion, will be controlled by the global elite, most likely the World Economic Forum. So the most obvious is a market crash, like we saw during the GFC, 2009, call it, to 2012. It really peaked out in 2006. So to go over the specific numbers, let's go to this chart. It goes all the way back to 1900. It's one that I use all the time, all the way to 2010, 2012. These are housing prices adjusted for inflation. This is an index, so on the left we go from 60 up to 200. Our starting point is right at 100 in the year 1900. Flat lines goes down during the Depression, back up, World War II, flattens out, kind of goes up and down there in the 70s and 80s. And then, as we know, in the late 90s going into 2000, it goes completely parabolic. The prices absolutely skyrocketed. And we know that's because the lending standards decreased, interest rates went down. We all know the story. But then from 2006 to 2012, the prices came all the way back down. Where? To their historic trend line, going all the way back to 1900. And this makes sense because housing prices at the end of the day really should just go up with the rate of inflation, because housing prices at the end of the day should be tied to wages, which usually go up, although they lag slightly with the rate of inflation. So another way to think about this, and the reason this makes sense, is because home prices are tied to wages, and wages are tied to inflation. Therefore, most of the time, the housing prices should stay consistent with the rate of inflation. And I know a lot of you are saying, George, well, interest rates are far lower than they were before. And yeah, I get it. But at some point in time, the interest rates have to normalize. And when they do, that will put extreme downward pressure on housing prices. Even if the rates don't normalize, at some point, we will have to get back down to this historic trend line. Now, I believe if the rates stay this low, that we will get back down to this level, not in nominal terms, but in real terms. You see, the price of housing can go up by 5% per year, as an example. But in real terms, as far as purchasing power, the price can go down by, let's say, 10% a year if the rate of inflation is 15%. 5% up, 15% rate of inflation, therefore a 10% net loss to your purchasing power. But let's just assume for a moment that prices crash again like they did between 2006 and 2012. How many homeowners back during that time frame would have sold to the government for 100 cents on the dollar? meaning if the government offered them 100% of what they actually paid for the house. I think a large majority of the population that were homeowners, because they were upside down on their house, they had negative equity, and a lot of them were forced into foreclosure, and in some cases, even bankruptcy. So let's think this through. Going back to step number 2, the government has already got you to comply with wearing masks, social distancing, closing your business, locking yourself in your own house, and they've also conditioned you to accepting money, quote unquote, free money from the government in the form of PPP loans, stimmy checks, and additional unemployment benefits. And I know that this doesn't apply to everyone, but it applies to a good majority of Americans. So is it really a stretch to think that if we do have another crash in nominal home prices, that the majority of Americans will gladly give the keys to their house to the government in exchange for 100 cents on the dollar, especially considering the fact that they've already agreed to put that sign in their front yard? The government already has their foot through the psychological door. But I think that's an obvious scenario which may lead you to sell your house to them. Now, let's go over some of the not so obvious ways they may try to pull off their objective. And I think these next 2 strategies are just as probable, if not more probable, than the strategy they may employ if the housing market crashes back down to its historic trend line in nominal terms. Editor, let's go right to the internet to explore how they may leverage unrealized capital gains and climate change to take your property.
Let's start by going over an article from Business Insider. And they state that even Janet Yellen has been talking about unrealized capital gains tax. So what is that? That means that if your house goes from $100,000 up to $500,000 in nominal price, they would tax you on the $400,000 gain even if you didn't sell your house. So you would be liable for, let's say, 40% of the $400,000 gain. So that would be $160,000 of tax that you would have to pay today, even though you didn't sell your house. So where are you going to come up with $160,000? Well, let's say you can't. Well, I think the government may give you an option where if you can't pay the tax, or if you don't want to pay the tax, you can simply sell to the Treasury, to Janet Yellen, to Jerome Powell, to the Fed, whomever, but you can sell for 100 cents on the dollar and you won't have to pay the tax. So the money becomes, or the dollars become, a liability of the Fed, and they get your house as an asset on their balance sheet. And if you don't have the 160,000 to pay the tax, this option becomes very, very attractive. So number one, they could get you to sell your house to them by the market crashing and you having negative equity. Number two, they could do it if they implement what they've been talking about a lot on the left and a lot of these politicians and a lot of the global elite, and that's setting up an unrealized capital gains tax. But the third possible strategy, I think, is the most likely. That's climate change. To explore that further, let's go to a recent article from CNBC. Retrofitting homes could be vital if governments want to hit aggressive targets. So key points: in an ideal world, all resident spaces would use low carbon, sustainable, and energy efficient technology. The reality is different, however. A lot of housing stock is decades, even centuries old. They go on to point out that the challenge is considerable. If we take a closer look at the UK, a 2019 report from the Committee on Climate Change, they described homes as not fit for the future. It added, going forward, the UK's 29 million existing homes would have to be made low carbon, low energy, and resilient to climate change. Well, in order to make all the housing stock in the United States and the UK low carbon, low energy, and resilient to climate change, it would take a staggering amount of money per house. Well, let's just assume for a moment they made this mandatory. Remember, in 2020, they locked you in your own house to save lives. Well, why wouldn't they force you to retrofit your house, even though it cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars in the future, in an effort to save humanity? So if you don't have that type of money, what would you do? Well, I think again, the government would come in and say, hey, don't worry about it. If you don't have the $200,000 needed to go ahead and make your house green, well, then we'll go ahead and buy it from you for 100 cents on the dollar, and you can go ahead and rent it from us for less than you are paying on your mortgage. So forcing people to retrofit their property for climate change could be a way to get the majority of Americans to sell them their home, even if housing prices don't go down, or even if taxes don't go up. I'd also like to point out that the World Economic Forum's main initiative is climate change. Therefore, leveraging the fear of climate change, I think, is the most probable strategy they will use to take your property. Of course, for the greater good.
So we now know what their vision is for 2030 and beyond. We also know that psychologically, they have set up society, whether it was intentionally or unintentionally, to be far more receptive to saying yes to the central planners, the government, and the politicians in the future. We've also walked through a few scenarios and strategies they may use to take your property, or at least buy it from you at 100 cents on the dollar. So at the end of the day, you will own nothing and they will own everything. So now you understand the possibilities. Again, there are no certainties. There are only possibilities. I'm not saying that this is going to play out. This is not a prediction. I'm merely going over possibilities, incentives, motives, and explain to you, the viewer, the global elite's vision for the future. So all of us can make better financial decisions for our futures, protect our property, and maybe even more importantly, protect our freedom from those global elite that want to take it all away from us. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.